My name is Isabel Roth, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the staff and the owners, I'd like to welcome you all to the store, and thank you for coming. I also happen to be the daughter of a playwright, and my dad was pretty jealous when he found out that I would have the honor of introducing Ken Ludwig and his new book, How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare. Ken has had 6 shows on Broadway and 6 in the West End, with works performed in more than 30 countries and in over 20 languages. He has won numerous awards, including 2 Laurence Olivier Awards, 3 Tonys, and most importantly, 2 Helen Hayes Awards. In addition to his success on Broadway and abroad, Mr. Ludwig remains an active and important member of the Washington theater community. He is one of the reasons that Washington is one of the most vibrant theater towns in this country. With How to Teach Your Children Shakespeare, Ken is sharing his love of theater with all of us and teaching us how to share it with the people we love. As Rocco Landsman so eloquently put it, if you love the English language and in its most exalted form, if you love children and love life, you will love this book. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Ken Ludwig.
I thought I'd start out actually with a theater story, but only because it's got it's very book related, and I don't get to tell this very often. And it has to do with Hal Holbrook, who's quoted on the back of the book. He's the great American actor. He's in Lincoln. You know, he does Mark Twain Tonight, and I think he's probably the greatest actor in America. And he was in one of my shows called Be My Baby with his wife, Dixie Carter. And we became great friends during it. He came to our house to do an initial reading of it. The show goes on. It's a big success. We become very close. And at Christmas of that year, he comes and brings me a Christmas present. It was about a week after Christmas. It's all wrapped up. And he says to me, Ken, and this is a book story. This is sort of why it relates to Politics and Prose, sort of. He says, Ken, he says, I have this Christmas present for you. I want you to have this book. This is from Dixie and me. He says, but before you open it, he says, I got to tell you a little about this present. He says, I went to one of those really high-end booksellers that do sell antique books in New York City, and found her a first edition of this Robert Burns collection of poetry. He says, really expensive. I knew she'd really like this. And he says, so I gave it to her Christmas morning. She opens it up, takes one look, gives a whoop, and throws it across the room and says, get this book out of our house. Turns out it's a book of Robert Burns' erotic poetry. And I mean of the dirtiest poetry you have, like I think it's the Lays of Scotland, and it's Lays, all right. And so she says there. So she said, get it out of the house. So I'm giving it to you. So I brought it. Now, I brought it because so then I open it, I unwrap it, and I read the inscription. And the inscription is for one each. First Hal, then Dixie. Hal, very nice and flowery, what you'd say to somebody to be nice. Ken, my wonderful literary friend in love with theater, blah, 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 blah. From Hal. And he says, P.S., don't show this to your wife. And then Dixie writes, Dearest Ken, remember, I had nothing to do with this. Oh, isn't that sweet? Well, but I keep it. I thought I'd start out by we'll turn to the book now. And I thought I'd start out by telling you my favorite, one of my favorite quotations, because it relates so well to the book, and it's by Henry James, the great American novelist, who wrote in a letter to Nathaniel Hawthorne. He said this in passing in his letter. He said, "The flower of art blooms only where the soil is deep." Let me repeat it. The flower of art blooms only where the soil is deep. And Henry James, being Henry James, I'm sure he meant it in a number of different ways. Partly he meant it because in his life as an American, he transplanted himself to Europe, and he wrote mostly in England. He ultimately became a British citizen, and he wrote in France. And he meant that for him, his art was able to bloom because the soil was deep in England and France and that civilization. He clearly also meant it in this way, that the soil with the flower of art blooms within each of us when the soil is deep within us. And the way we deepen our soil, the way we make ourselves capable of having art that flowers, one of the principal ways is by reading and knowing Shakespeare. I think that's really important. That's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book because my life has been filled with Shakespeare. I've studied Shakespeare ever since I was young. I've loved it. And I want to communicate this to everyone. It deepens us in a number of ways. It deepens us, first of all, because his plays and his poetry gives us a perspective about life that we just don't get anywhere else. If you think about communicating these stories to your kids, well, Romeo and Juliet gives us a little look into issues, more than a little, gives us a look into issues of parental control, making hasty decisions, young love, issues for youngsters of suicide, issues of despair. King Lear brings also great questions of parental and how to control older parents as they grow and younger children who are not what you hoped they would be. As You Like It, young love. Twelfth Night, love for siblings. Very interesting. I mean, that's really what Twelfth Night is about, is this, the center of Twelfth Night, unlike the way most people play it. Twelfth Night is really about Viola and her love for her long-lost twin brother, who she thinks at the beginning of the play is dead and has perished in the storm. Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer Night's Dream is very much gives us perspective on the whole question of imagination and writing and creation. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. He talks about writing and what it is to be imaginative. So these plays, one way they deepen us and will deepen our children is they give us a real perspective into who we are, into our lives. Another thing they do is they encourage us as writers. They make us better writers by example, simply because he's the greatest author that ever lived. They also make us better readers. And the reason they make us better readers is because all literature since 1600, all literature in our Western culture, is so deeply influenced by Shakespeare. You can't read Jane Austen with any depth and really understand Jane Austen unless you know your Shakespeare, because she really knew her Shakespeare. Same with Charles Dickens. Same with really smart people who create popular culture. The Godfather is filled with Shakespearean references. P.G. Wodehouse. We went to our family, my family who's here, we went on Friday night to a Wolf Trap and saw La Traviata. Verdi was a huge Shakespearean. He lived for Shakespeare. Three of his operas are based on Shakespeare, and he had in the works, he was dying to write an opera based on King Lear. So it makes you a better reader in the sense it makes you a real reader. You can't understand these people unless you know your Shakespeare. Another way it deepens our lives is it gives us certain ethical guidelines, especially when you think about this as how to teach your children Shakespeare. As your kids grow up, it gives you certain ethical guidelines about how to live your life. In essence, Shakespeare was rooting for a sort of kinder, gentler humanity that we somehow follow. He's always spending most of his time asking questions. He's rarely answering them. He certainly has plenty of brutality and violence laced through everything from Titus Andronicus to King Lear. But ultimately, he's on Cordelia's side. Ultimately, he's on the side of the wronged person. And that's, as something to communicate to your children, is an important thing. So why do we study Shakespeare, and why did I write this book? I wrote it because he is the greatest author who ever lived. And once we start understanding him, we become better people because of it. It makes a big difference in our lives. Now, is it controversial to say he's the greatest author who ever lived? I don't think so. But I brought a couple quotations with me in the handouts. Don't read ahead of me, but but let me just tell you where they fit in. Here's how I say it. I was a music theory and composition major in college, and I was lucky enough, I studied with Leonard Bernstein. I do know music. I know music pretty well. If you say that the average person who writes is say, standing on the floor, we're little tiny people on that floor, and Mozart was at that ceiling, in literature, Shakespeare is at the top of the Capitol, or maybe at the top of the Empire State Building. It's that great. Once you get to know it, it's truly that great. It's this God-given creation that happened that whether you believe in God or not, that somehow this person was put on earth who could see things that no one else could see. It's that remarkable. It's that amazing. I was reading some diaries of Virginia Woolf, a wonderful book that I bought here called Virginia Woolf's Writer's Diary. Her husband Leonard had extracted all the best parts of her diary having to do with writing. And I came across a quote, and you have it there. And it's from Virginia Woolf's diaries, and I'm going to read it, but you can follow it because it's a little complex. And here's what she says. Here she's one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century, hands down. You couldn't find a more intelligent or a smarter human being than Virginia Woolf. Her essays in The Common Reader are about literature and life are amazing. And here's what she says about Shakespeare. She says, I read Shakespeare directly after I have finished writing, when my mind is agape and red hot. Then it is astonishing. I never yet knew how amazing his stretch and speed and word-coining power is until I felt it utterly outpace and outrace my own, seeming to start equal, and then I see him draw ahead and do things I could not in my wildest tumult and utmost press of mind imagine. The words drop so fast one can't pick them up. Why then should anyone else attempt to write? This is not writing at all. Indeed, I could say that Shakespeare surpasses literature altogether, if I knew what I meant. And this is to herself in her diary. She doesn't write this because she's praising somebody at a bookstore and is telling about her enthusiasms. This is how writers feel about Shakespeare. It just goes beyond anything else. Let me tell you a little bit about the book and how it came about. Because then what I want to do is I want us to all memorize at least 3 lines of Shakespeare the way you do with your kids. It'd be kind of fun. I picked a passage that's a fun one, and a fun one to show how remarkably what a remarkable genius he is. The book came about because my daughter was in first grade. Her name's Olivia, named after the Countess Olivia. And she comes home from first grade and says, "Guess what, Daddy? I know a bank where the wild time blows." It's kind of like Jump Back Jack. You know, that's a famous line from Shakespeare. Where did that come from? And it turns out her teacher in first grade, a remarkable woman named Elizabeth Allen, taught the kids some Shakespeare. And Elizabeth is here, and my daughter's here. Stand up so they both know. All right, everybody knows here. Right. My daughter's grown up. She's now 21. I'm sorry. Stab me in the heart. Why don't you just stab me now and leave me for dead? So Olivia, honestly, Elizabeth Allen was the start of all this because she is English. Hopefully you get to meet her later. And she loves Shakespeare and decided she would teach her first grade class some Shakespeare. So they learned the first few lines of this. It's not a soliloquy. It's something that Oberon says to Puck when he's received the magic flower. And he says, I know a bank where the wild time blows, where ox slips and the nodding violet grows, quite over-canopied with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, and with eglantine. There sleeps Titania some time of the night, lulled in these fashions with dances and delight, and there lulled in these flowers, my daughter's going flowers, they're lulled in these flowers with dances and delight, and there the snake throws her enameled skin weed wide enough to wrap a fairy in. And they learned that. And there's so much to mine from just that one quote. Sometimes I have friends learn that quote first if I want to teach them Shakespeare. It's more for kids, so it's perfect. But I know a bank where the wild time blows. What does blows mean? Well, blows, you think maybe it just means the breeze blowing along the bank, but it doesn't. The word blows in Elizabethan England meant burst into flower. It means blooms. It doesn't mean, it has a different meaning entirely than we have. I know a bank where the wild time blows, where ox slips and the nodding violet grows. Why ox slips? It's another kind of flower. Well, ox slips is hard to say, and therefore it slows you down. Shakespeare is always telling you how to say his lines right in the words themselves. He's always telling you by the number of syllables, by the consonants that are next to each other, but by the vowels that are next to each other. So I thought, ooh, a light bulb went off in my head when Olivia came back and said this. I thought, I've loved Shakespeare all my life. I've spent my life studying it. Why? I don't know. I was the nerd. I was sitting there studying Hamlet and listening to Richard Burton recordings on an LP my parents got me, and learning all the soliloquies. And it turns out it was a pretty great thing to do, and it made my life happier and deeper and greater. So I thought, what I ought to do is try to teach the kids. My son was too young at the time. When he got to be 6 years old, I started him. We did this throughout her entire childhood, right up to the time she went to college. Half hour on Saturdays, half hour on Sundays. We'd sit together, snuggle up in the bed, and learn passage after passage. Because what I figured out was that the way to teach kids Shakespeare is to memorize short passages, then they get longer, then they get more complex. Because by memorizing it, you've got to know it. You can't cheat when you memorize. You either know it or you don't know it. And you've got to learn the actual words and really know what they mean, or you really can't memorize them with any meaning. So what this book has is it has 25 passages. They're not the first 25 I did with Olivia and then my son Jack in a row, because I wanted this to be an overview of the process. But they're very much in order. It starts with I Know a Bank, then goes to a very nice, easy, another Midsummer Night's Dream. Captain of our fairy band, Helena, is here at hand. The idea being that I started with the comedies, because comedies are a lot more accessible for kids. Started with Midsummer Night's Dream, went to Twelfth Night, went to Much Ado About Nothing, but didn't get to Much Ado in the book because I had to limit it to 25 passages. But at the end of the 25, I listed another 55 that I used with my kids. We got through that many. I mean, this was their whole, don't forget, 6th grade till she went off to college. That's a lot of Shakespeare. Till she knew, I'd say, over 1,000 lines of Shakespeare. I'm really putting her on the spot here. But so that they're at your fingertips, so that you can say them without, the trick is to be able to say them without thinking of it, because they are just so much a part of your muscle memory. Titania to Oberon when they're having their fight. These are the forgeries of jealousy, and never since the middle summer spring met we in hill and dale, forest or mead, by pavy fountain or by rushy brook, or in the beached margent of the sea, to dance our ringlets to the whistling wind. But with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport. You need to know this in a way that's inside you. And when you start kids when they're that young, as you know, kids are sponges. They just absorb this stuff at that age, and there's no resistance. The thing about Shakespeare, and it's worth saying here, is that everybody is afraid of Shakespeare once you get to about 10 years old. You open, I brought some with me. If you open it anywhere and you read a passage My gentle Puck, come hither. Thou remember since once I sat upon a promontory and heard a mermaid on a dolphin's back, uttering such dulcet and harmonious breath that the rude sea grew civil at her song, and certain stars shot madly from their spheres to hear the sea maid's music. You honestly, you go, what the hell did that mean? What is he talking about? What is going on? And the reason we find it baffling is it was written 450 years ago. Words are different. They just have different meanings. What's a bodkin? Phrases are different. We have different syntax. The verb, noun, noun, verb is in different order. He's constantly talking in metaphors. Constantly. Some of them are easy. Romeo, not that one, the one, what he says. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Well, it's a metaphor. He's calling Juliet the sun. That's an easy one. In Henry V, when he's trying to get his troops ready for battle, and he says, make faces at the enemy, make faces at the French, make your eyes bulge out of your head. What does he say? He says, then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it pry through the portage of the face like the brass cannon. Well, it's beautiful, but if you read it the first time, you say, what is he talking about? So you have to understand each word, and then you memorize it. Take your time and memorize it. And you memorize it by doing a couple tricks I learned along the way. One of them is the way they reproduce this handout. If you turn it around and look at the quote by Orsino from Twelfth Night, is actually, it looks like this, just so we could make it a one-page handout. Politics and Prose was nice enough to put it a lot on one page. But one page normally looks like this, because what I discovered was, with kids, it's so much easier if it's big print, and it's an accessible font, and it's easy to read. Because kids at 6 years old are just starting to learn to read, and we did this way until the day she went off to college, because it's still easier. It's still easier to do it this way, and to hear the passages. I was able to read the passages to the kids because I know Shakespeare. But what do you do if you're yourself not familiar with Shakespeare? I mean, I'm hoping this book will be used by adults and go, Shakespeare was a place in my life that I never really learned, but this is a place I can just start from scratch, not be embarrassed that if I find it difficult, because everybody finds it difficult, and just learn how to read and love Shakespeare. So what I did for the oral, A-U-R-A-L part, or I suppose O-R-A-L too, is I had, because I couldn't read it and I didn't want to put them down, I called a friend of mine. This is name dropping heaven. Good friend of mine is Derek Jacobi in London. And I called up Derek and I said, would you do me a favor? This is a big favor because it's going to take up a whole day. Would you go into a studio and record the passages from this book for me? And he did. So if you go, and this is free, if you simply go to the website for the book, howtoteachyourchildrenshakespeare.com, you will hear Derek and Richard Clifford, his partner, and then he calls me about the day before he's going into the studio to record these. He said, Ken, don't you want, he says with an English accent, sounds better when he said it, Ken, don't you want to have a woman's voice in this too? You have some women's passages. I said, well, I'd love to. I didn't know who to ask. He says, you mind if I ask my friend Frances Barber? Well, Frances Barber, I had just seen her do Cleopatra at the Old Globe. She's one of the greatest English actresses ever. So you'll hear, if you just go to howtoteachyourchildrenshakespeare.com, when you get home, it's free. Click on the passages, and you'll hear them read all the passages from the book. And it is the most beautiful, honest to God, it is honestly the most beautiful recording of Shakespeare I've ever heard. It's stunning. So let's quick. I know I have limited time. I probably have 5 minutes to talk because then we're going to do a Q&A. But let's quick go to, I want to read you one more great quote. I want us to share one more great quote about Shakespeare with you. And that is a quote from Robert Frost. Robert Frost was at a meeting, probably much like this, and he was asked by one of his students, I don't know if it was one of his students, but a youngster, someone young, Mr. Frost, why should we worry about form in literature? Why does form matter? Because Shakespeare is all about form. Shakespeare's all poetry and and prose. I mean, it's about 60-40, but the prose has a certain formalism to it, and certainly, of course, the poetry is. It's all in iambic pentameter, except when he moves into 4 beats for certain songs and certain chants. There's a great formalism about Shakespeare, and of course there is about Robert Frost's poetry too. Any great poet's poetry. But this pompous kind of student says, why should I worry about that? He essentially said, isn't writing better, especially today in this late 20th century, that it's spontaneous and comes viscerally from our gut? Aren't we all going through such horrible times that what I write down is just as valuable as what you write down because it just comes from my gut and it's visceral? And here's what Robert Frost said. I just came across this recently. I thought it was so startling. He said, and it's on there, you can follow it. I lost my nearest friend in the one they called the Great War. So did Achilles lose his friend in war. And Homer did no injustice to his grief by writing about it in dactylic hexameters. Such grief can only be told in form. Without it, you've got nothing but a stubbed toe cry. Sincere, maybe, for what it's worth, but with no depth or carry, no echo. You may have a grievance, but you do not have grief. So if someone says to you, well, why am I studying Shakespeare? Why does that matter? Isn't it just as good what I read if I pick up a chick lit novel? Not that we shouldn't read chick lit novels. Not that everything doesn't have its place. But why spend so much time and make this important to ourselves? And that's the reason. Because it matters. It has depth. It has carry. Let's look at one. Let's look at a quickly, because I know we don't have much time. Let's look at Orsino's opening speech. I thought it would be fun. Let's try to memorize the first 3 lines of it. The opening speech of Twelfth Night opens with this pretty pompous guy, this guy who's living in this very overheated world that's full of flowers and perfume, because he's in love with his woman, he's the Count Orsino, and he's in love with his woman who's at a different, lives in an estate on the other side of Illyria where they live, and he loves the Countess Olivia because she's so beautiful and so charming. And he says, and music is playing in the background because he's rich, he's a count, he has musicians playing. I'll read the lines we're going to memorize. I'm going to talk about them and then we'll memorize them. If music be the food of love, play on. So what's the first thing we have? The first thing we have is a metaphor. It's a metaphor that hunger equals love. Hunger and love. And what is the food for love? Music. And what is the food for hunger? Well, food we eat. If music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die. That's what we're going to learn. He then goes on and says, that phrase again, it had a dying fall. Oh, it came o'er my ear like the sweet sound that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing and giving odor. Enough, no more. 'Tis not so sweet now as it was before. I think you have all those lines. So let me talk about the lines and then we'll memorize it. If music be the food of love, play on. What is it? First, let's just tear this piece apart. Let's tear these few lines apart. What's interesting about that is in regular iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is the form of poetry that Shakespeare, and when you teach your kids this would maybe the 5th or 6th thing. Maybe they'll learn this when they're 8 or 9 years old. Well, they're happy to learn about what is iambic pentameter. Well, pentameter is pent is 5, and iamb is a poetic foot that goes da-dum. Not dum-dum or dum-da, dum-da. It goes da-dum. So 5 of those are da-dum, 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 da-dum. That is a line of iambic pentameter. Now listen to the first line of this. It is in very regular iambic pentameter. If music be the food of love, play on. Now, not everything Shakespeare wrote was in regular iambic pentameter, because if it was, you'd fall asleep. You'd hear the same rhythm over and over. So what does he do? Let's look at the next line. Give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die. What he's doing essentially is playing jazz with language. It's as if, think of a 12-tone blues row, that if you set up a ground, you set up a certain expectation. If music be the food of love, play on. If music be the food of love, play on. If it was regular, it would be, give me excess of it that's surfeiting. We don't say it that way. We say, give me excess of it that's surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die. He's surfing across the language in a way, and he's very aware of it. He knows exactly what he's doing. Let me add, though I know we can't get to it. In this opening 6-8 lines is every major theme of the play of Twelfth Night. He's laced into it. If music be the food of love, 7th word in the whole thing is love. Plays deeply, Twelfth Night's deeply about love. Give me excess of it. Excess. It's all about excess. Malvolio is excessively in love with Olivia, and he dresses up and puts on cross garters and yellow stockings. Orsino certainly excessively also in love with Olivia. That's surfeiting the appetite. Surfeiting is when you eat too much. You do something of so much that it becomes revolting to you. We see that. We see that in Sir Andrew. That strain, again, it had a dying fall. Dying. It's full. This play is full of death and dying. An appetite may sicken and so die. He then says, oh, it came o'er my ears like the sweet sound that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing and giving odor. Why would you think he'd say, oh, it came over my ear like a sweet sound that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing and giving odor? I think the answer is because he does this in Midsummer Night's Dream a lot, is he's mingling the senses. That love is so overpowering that it affects us in all our different senses, that it becomes so much of us that we can't explain, we can't limit it to one sense.
Thanks, Ken. I have a question that relates to something that's in Tom Friedman's recent book. He talks about the need for improving the quality of teaching. He brings up an episode where one of the teachers he was following was a 9th grade teacher teaching English and teaching Julius Caesar. And he observed the teacher across the hall in another section of 9th grade English also teaching Julius Caesar. And the young teacher said, maybe this isn't the right profession for me to be in. And this resonated with me because we were taught Julius Caesar the same way in 9th grade and had a bad impact on life. Do you have any ideas on how they're teaching?
And the bad idea was because people next door were getting the same play the same way, and it was sort of boring. Yeah. Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Well, I do. I have very strong thoughts about it. First of all, contrary to the fact that a lot of high schools do Julius Caesar, I actually say in the book, I think it's a terrible play to start kids off with. It's about politics. It's deeply about politics. It's a political play. Why in the world start people with Julius Caesar? You get them off on the wrong foot. That's number one. Number two is, there was a in the front page of the New York Times about 4 weeks ago, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences just came out with a report about the humanities, and that so many fewer and fewer people are majoring in humanities in college. What are we? And actually, the guy who wrote the intro to the book, John Lithgow, was on the panel. And why are we? How are we teaching the humanities badly? The people aren't dying to be in them the way they used to. The numbers are going down and down and down and down. And boy, great feed for me. That's why I wrote the book. I'm trying to make it in a way that it's exciting for people. That's exactly right.
So thinking about teaching, I remember we started out with Julius Caesar too in 9th grade, and also Romeo and Juliet, but it was an expurgated version of Romeo and Juliet. Is that still an issue today, that the plays are considered not only too difficult but too racy?
Well, you raise a very interesting question about expurgating Shakespeare, because I'm suggesting to Random House doing a second companion volume telling the stories of Shakespeare. There's really only one great book of the stories of Shakespeare, and it was written 200 years ago by Charles and Mary Lamb, called Tales from Shakespeare. But they expurgated it like crazy. They took out all the dirty bits. Then in the 19th century, along came a guy named Charles Bowdler, and Bowdler Bowdlerized Shakespeare. And to Bowdlerize Shakespeare is to really take all the dirty bits out. It was supposed to, in the introduction, said, only going to do Shakespeare in a way that your father could tell a daughter. Mm-hmm. That was his. So Shakespeare has been expurgated and changed and knocked around. The great 18th century Shakespearean David Garrick, even though he started to try to bring Shakespeare back to sort of pure Shakespeare, even he played King Lear with a happy ending. Even he, I swear to you, I've been I'm on the board of governors of the Shakespeare of the Folger, and I've been thinking, wouldn't it be cool to do Garrick's version? Garrick wrote a scene for Romeo and Juliet in the tomb so they'd have a great love scene at the end for about 5 pages before they died. It's all Garrick. They don't talk to each other in the tomb because they miss each other. One dies, the other wakes up, the other dies. So the question of real Shakespeare is important, but nowadays more and more. I remember when my kids were studying, not Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet. You know, the opening stuff with Peter and who the servants, I bite my thumb at you. It is the first 3 pages of Romeo and Juliet is filthy. It's tremendously filthy. Shakespeare's always putting tricky. He loved doing that. You find it in the odd. I only discovered it in Twelfth Night, and I know Twelfth Night backwards and forwards. Is that when Malvolio finds the letter, he says, and he's supposedly in Olivia's handwriting. He says, "Will these be her C's, her U's, N, her T's?" And not only that, but the word without the N in it was also synonymous with the word with the N in it. Moreover, he then says, "and thus makes she her great P's." Cheap joke, but a good joke. Always gets a laugh. So the issue of cutting Shakespeare has always been with us. And, sure, if you're going to cut it, people write to me about my own plays. I got my manager called me not long ago saying they want to do Leading Ladies in some sweet township in Pennsylvania, and they gave a list of all the things they were going to have to cut from it. Swear word, all the swear words and all the oaths and all the Jesus Christ and all this and that and the other thing. And it's fine. It's fine. I'm sure he would have been happy if it was cut as long as his work got done.
I'm sure that when Shakespeare wrote, he wrote to have his plays performed. And the difficult thing is if you're not an oral learner, you can get lost. So other than memorizing, that's a great way. What else would you recommend other than reading the plays in advance?
Well, seeing them. Go to the shows.
But seeing them, you don't always catch. That's what I'm saying.
Well, that is true. But, one of the things about seeing them, this is what I always told my kids, was it's a little like going, I'm a big opera freak. And when you go to the opera, as much as I'm trying to follow everything in the opera, follow the, interesting harmonic changes, this and that, I miss most of it. We all do. And with Shakespeare, the best thing to do is kind of know the story in advance and surf along with it and just let this fantastic music pour over you. And if you don't follow some of it, so what? You can't. It's too dense. You're gonna miss tons of illusions anyway. So just let this wonderful. The sounds are so beautiful. And he's always, as I say, the most interesting thing is he's telling the actors how to say the sounds in Midsummer Night's Dream when Oberon and Titania are fighting about the little changeling boy, and she says why he's so important to her. She says, well, it's because his mother was my best friend, and she died in childbirth. And he says, and he has this huge, wonderful speech. I'll forget some of it, but it's his mother was a votaress of my order, and in the spiced Indian air by night full often hath she gossiped by my side, and sat with me on Neptune's yellow sands, marking the embarked traders on the flood. And then as he goes on, and she tells about this, and then at the very end she says, but he being mortal But she, being mortal, of that child did die. And for his sake do I rear up her boy, and for her sake I will not part with him. Now, what has Shakespeare done there? He has used all monosyllables. All the words are single syllables, and he's done it to slow the actors up, and so that each word matters, because she's gotten to her peroration. And for her sake will I rear up her boy, and for her sake I will not part with him. So if you sit there and you just take all this in, somehow it will communicate. Those moods through the actors will communicate themselves to you, and you don't have to know everything it says. Doesn't matter. You'll figure it out. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.